The storm raged over the coastal city of Blackwater Bay, throwing angry waves against the pier and making the windows of the small wooden house shake. The wind whistled through the empty streets, carrying the smell of sea air mixed with the scent of wet earth. Indoors, Daniel Carter, a 45-year-old former police officer, prepared coffee, while his daughter Lucy, just 7 years old, played on the living room carpet with his building blocks. The house was simple but cozy, lit by the flickering light of the fireplace. Since his wife had passed away the previous year, Daniel and Lucy were learning to live only for each other. Lucy stacked the blocks with concentration, her small face lit by the fire. "Dad, did Mom like storms?" he asked, without taking his eyes off the construction he was creating. Daniel stopped for a moment. "I would like to," he replied with a sad smile. "She said the rain cleaned everything and left the air cleaner." The girl smiled, satisfied with the answer, but at that moment something made her freeze, his eyes fixed on the front door. "Daddy, there's someone out there." Daniel frowned. "What?" Lucy pointed to the door, and then he listened, a weak, insistent scratch. Setting the coffee cup aside, Daniel slowly stood up and walked to the door. When I opened it, the cold, damp wind rushed in, sending droplets of rain inside. But Daniel didn't even care about that. There, lying on the threshold, there was a huge dog, soaked and injured. Its black fur was covered in mud and dried blood. He was breathing hard, his body shaking. Lucy approached, holding the hem of her pajamas. "Daddy, he's hurt." The dog raised his head slightly and fixed his eyes on Daniel, deep, almost human eyes that conveyed a silent plea. Daniel stood still. His instinct told him that picking up an unfamiliar dog, let alone an injured one, could be dangerous. But something in that look made him hesitate. He looked at Lucy, who was now holding his hand, her eyes shining with a mix of fear and compassion. "He needs us, Daddy," he whispered. Daniel took a deep breath, making his decision. "Let's help him." Daniel picked up the dog carefully, feeling the animal's weight tremble in his arms. The thick, dark fur was matted with mud and blood, and the smell of salt water and open wounds filled the air. "Lucy, get a towel," he said, closing the door with his foot. The girl ran to the bathroom and came back with the biggest towel she could find. Daniel placed the dog on a blanket in front of the fireplace, covering him with the towel to keep him warm. The animal did not react aggressively. He just stood there, breathing hard, his eyes watching Daniel and Lucy's every move. "He's really hurt," Lucy whispered, kneeling down next to the dog. Daniel analyzed the animal more closely. There was a deep cut on the side of the body, probably caused by a knife. Furthermore, his thinness indicated that he had been without food for days. "That wasn't an accident," Daniel muttered to himself. Lucy gently passed her hand over the dog's head, who closed his eyes for a moment and sighed. "He trusts us," she said. Daniel sighed, pulling out his phone. "I needed professional help." Dialed to Martha Collins, a retired veterinarian who lived nearby. Martha answered with a sleepy voice. "Daniel, what happened?" "I need your help. A dog showed up at my door, injured. It looks like someone attacked it." Martha was silent for a moment. "I'm going over there now." While they waited, Lucy didn't let go of the dog. "What are we going to call him?" she asked. Daniel hesitated. He didn't want his daughter to get attached, as he didn't know if they could keep the dog. But before she could respond, Lucy whispered, "Shadow. Because he looks like a shadow in the storm." The dog opened his eyes when he heard the girl's voice. Then something surprising happened. His tail thumped lightly against the ground, a subtle gesture of acceptance. Daniel was intrigued. Why did that dog show up at their house? And more importantly, who was he running from? As the night progressed, the storm outside increased, making the house even more isolated. Daniel and Lucy stayed beside the dog, who was now calmer, although he was still breathing heavily. With every breath he took, he seemed weaker, as if he was struggling to stay alive. It was then that Martha arrived, bringing with him a first aid kit and a serious expression. She quickly analyzed the dog, cleaning the wound carefully and applying a makeshift bandage to ease the pain. "That cut is not an accidental injury," she said, frowning. "It feels like the work of a sharp, precise knife. Something much more personal." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean by that?" Martha hesitated, looking at the dog, who was still motionless. "This dog isn't here by chance, Daniel. He ran away from someone, and he's not just injured, he's marked." She got up and went to the window, looking at the street lit by the stormlight. "There's something wrong with this. His behavior, the way he's bonding so quickly with you guys. I've seen it before. This dog was trained to protect someone." "But protect who?" Daniel asked, but Martha was already reaching for her phone. She typed something quickly and then showed the screen to Daniel. "Do you know that name?" She pointed to the screen, where there was a photo of a middle-aged man with a serious face and deep eyes. Daniel took a quick look. His name was Victor Collins, a name Daniel recognized. He was Martha's brother. "What about him?" Daniel asked. Curiosity mixed with a growing sense of danger. Martha looked at the phone, her face now etched with worry. "Victor's been missing for days, Daniel. He worked with dogs like this, dogs trained for protection missions. But there's something strange about all of this. He was investigating something before he disappeared." Suddenly, a sound from the front door interrupted them. A gentle but persistent scratching as before, followed by a small, muffled bark. The dog, Shadow, raised his head and looked directly at the door. His eyes glowed with an unsettling intensity, as if he were trying to communicate something. "He is warning you about something," Lucy said, her voice filled with a wisdom that Daniel didn't understand. "It's protecting us." Daniel jumped up. He knew that connection between Shadow and his daughter was special, but now he felt that the situation was about to become even more dangerous. What was happening? It was obvious that the dog was here for a reason, and perhaps the Victor Collins secrets were the key to understanding everything. The sound at the door stopped, but the tension remained in the air. Daniel approached slowly, picking up a baseball bat that he kept next to the door, an old habit. From when he was still a police officer, Martha picked up her phone again, ready to call someone if necessary. Lucy, however, didn't seem scared. She knelt beside Shadow, gently running her fingers through the dog's fur. "He knows who's out there," she said in a whisper. Daniel hesitated. Whoever it was wasn't knocking, I was waiting. Finally, he unlocked the door and opened it with caution. What he saw made his stomach turn. On the balcony, an envelope Pardo, it was lying on the ground, partially wet from the rain. There was no one around. The streets were deserted. He carefully picked up the envelope and carried it inside. Shadow watched every movement, as if he already knew what was there. Daniel opened the envelope. Inside, there was a single photo, a blurred image of Victor Collins, Martha's brother. But I wasn't alone. Beside him, a menacing-looking man held a knife. In the bottom corner of the photo, scrawled by hand, it was written, "He knew too much. Now the dog knows too." Daniel's blood ran cold. He looked at Martha, who turned pale. That means Victor might be alive," she murmured. "Or it could be a direct threat," Daniel replied, feeling adrenaline rush through his veins. Lucy tugged on Daniel's coat sleeve. "Shadow knows where he is, Dad. He wants to take us to him." Daniel looked at the dog. Shadow was already on his feet, looking at the door expectantly. He wasn't just running away, he was trying to guide them. "Let's follow him," Daniel decided. It was time to find out what was really happening. The rain had eased, but the air, was still charged with humidity and electricity, as if the world itself knew something important was about to happen. Daniel grabbed his jacket and a flashlight, while Martha grabbed a small revolver that she kept in her purse, an old habit. From when she worked in the police, Lucy insisted on going along. "Shadow needs me," she said, determined. Daniel wanted to deny it, but his daughter's firm gaze and the dog's reaction made him hesitate. Shadow clearly wanted Lucy to go. "Stay close to me at all times," Daniel said, taking the girl's hand. Shadow led the way. He led them through deserted streets until they reached the city limits. They passed a dirt road that led to an old abandoned fishing shed, close to the cliffs of the bay. That place was known to be a haven for criminals and smugglers in years past. "Are you sure he brought us here?" Martha asked, looking around. Before Daniel could respond, Shadow suddenly stopped. His ears pricked up, his body tense. So they listened, a muffled scream. It came from inside the warehouse. Daniel approached the rusty door and tried to open it, but it was locked. Shadow growled low, his eyes fixed on the entrance. "There's someone in there," Daniel muttered. Martha drew the gun. "We can try to be discreet, or we can be direct." Daniel looked at Lucy, who was holding Shadow tightly. The dog was still focused on the door. He made his decision. They couldn't waste time. "Stand back," he said, and then kicked the door hard. The rotting wood gave way, creaking. Inside, amidst the smell of mold and rust, Victor Collins was tied to a chair, with bruises on his face and a deep cut on his arm. Behind him, two silhouettes suddenly turned around. The first man was tall and thin, with cold eyes and a scar on his face. The second was more robust and held a knife, the same knife that had probably injured Shadow. "But this—" The scarred man started to speak, but before he could react, Shadow advanced. The dog jumped at the man with the knife, hitting him hard enough to knock him to the ground. The bandit screamed, trying to free himself, but Shadow kept him pressed against the floor. Martha pointed her gun at the other man. "Don't even try." Daniel ran to Victor, untying the ropes. "You need to get out of here," Victor managed to say, his voice hoarse. "They are not alone." Daniel looked at Martha and Lucy. They needed to get out quickly, but before they could run, an engine noise echoed outside. Others were arriving. The noise of the engine grew louder, approaching quickly. Headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the interior of the warehouse through cracks in the rotting boards. They were not alone. Daniel pulled Victor up, throwing his arm over his shoulders to help him walk. "We need to get out of here, now!" Shadow was still growling, keeping the knife man on the ground, teeth bared. The bandit was shaking, unable to move. The other criminal, seeing the situation, slowly raised his hands. "Look, we don't have to do this the hard way." Martha kept the gun pointed at him. "Don't move." Outside, car doors slammed. Harsh voices cut through the silence. "Hey, what the hell is going on in there?" Lucy, who was hugging Shadow's neck, whispered, "They came for the dog." Daniel exchanged a look with Martha. The girl wasn't wrong. Shadow didn't show up at their house by chance. He was running away from these men. Victor, still weak, muttered, "They were after something, information that Henry Walker, the veteran who trained me, hid. Shadow was the keeper." Daniel had no time for questions. If they stayed there any longer, they would be surrounded. "Behind the shed," Victor whispered, "there is an exit to the cliff. A narrow path leads to the beach." It was a risk, but the only option. "Shadow, come," called Lucy. The dog let out one last growl, pushed the knife away with his nose, and ran to Lucy's side. Martha kicked the other thug, making sure he didn't try anything, so they ran. Daniel helped Victor, while Shadow and Lucy went ahead. The sea wind hit them hard as they exited the back of the shed. But they weren't fast enough. A shot rang out. Daniel felt his heart stop. He turned his body to protect Lucy, but Shadow was faster. The dog jumped, as if foreseeing the danger. A pained bark escaped his throat as he fell onto the wet sand. "Shadow!" Lucy shouted, running over to him. Daniel turned around, seeing one of the men coming out of the warehouse holding a gun. Before he could shoot again, Martha reacted. Bang! Martha's shot hit one of the criminals' car lights, momentarily blinding them. That was all they needed. Victor pointed to a trail that led down to the beach. They ran. The tide was rising quickly, but the town was only a kilometer away across the sand. The police must have already been on their way. Martha had sent a quick message before they entered the warehouse. When they finally reached a safe area, the sirens approached. Martha waved frantically at the officers. "There, in the warehouse, they're armed!" Police cars whizzed past them, heading towards the criminals' hideout. But Daniel couldn't relax. Shadow was still down. Lucy was kneeling next to the dog, crying. "He saved us, Daddy." Martha quickly knelt down, examining him. "The bullet grazed him. We need to take him to the vet, but he's going to survive." Lucy hugged Shadow, her tears mixing with the light rain that began to fall. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, finally feeling the adrenaline subside. "I don't think he came just to ask for help, Lucy. I think he came to protect you." Shadow opened his eyes, and his tail thumped lightly against the sand. He accomplished its mission. 2 months had passed since that night when Shadow appeared on the Carter's doorstep. The city of Blackwater Bay normality had returned, but for Daniel, Lucy and Martha, everything had changed. Victor Collins had recovered from his injuries and gave a statement to the police, revealing the real reason the criminals were after him. Henry Walker, his former mentor, had stored evidence against a criminal organization that had been operating in the shadows for years. This information was protected in a location that only Shadow knew how to find. With the help of the dog, the police were able to locate a small metal box buried in the sand of a deserted beach, a place where Henry used to take Shadow for a walk. Inside the box, there were documents, photos, and even recordings that implicated powerful figures. The arrest of those involved was only a matter of time, but for Lucy, the biggest victory was something else. Shadow was alive. After weeks of veterinary care and physical therapy, he had finally regained his strength. Although his scar was a permanent reminder of what had happened, his spirit remained intact. Now, Shadow was an official member of the Carter family. That morning, Lucy ran along the beach, her blonde hair blowing in the wind, while Shadow ran alongside her, barking happily. Daniel watched them from afar, sipping his coffee, feeling a kind of peace he hadn't experienced in years. Martha approached, crossing her arms. "Are you used to the idea of having a dog?" Daniel laughed, shaking his head. "I've gotten used to the idea that this dog was always destined for us." Martha nodded. "You know, Henry used to say that dogs like Shadow don't choose their owners by chance. They know exactly where they need to be." Daniel looked at his daughter, who was now lying in the sand while Shadow snuggled up next to her. He had no doubt about it. Some souls find each other no matter what path they need to travel, and Shadow, against all odds, found its home. End.